Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Marecki, and I'm the director of the University of Illinois College of Law's New Leadership Project. We are coming to you live from the College of Law in Champaign, and I want to welcome our live audience of students. We have about 35 students here who are currently attending the College of Law. They are in the classes of 2022. Why don't you raise your hand if you're from 2022? All right, 2023 and 2024. All right,
Nice.
2024 wins. And I'd like to give a special welcome to our alumni and friends around the world who are joining us virtually by live stream. Today we'll be talking about leadership in the 21st century with our special guest, former Illinois Governor Jim Edgar. I think it's fair to say that Governor Edgar is one of the greatest leaders in Illinois history. Among his many accomplishments, he served as Secretary of State for 2 terms. Back in the 1980s. My first driver's license had his name on it. And,
very important.
Very important when you're that age.
Yep.
And he served for 2 terms as the 30th governor of Illinois from 1991 to 1999. And he continues to serve Illinois in many, many different ways. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Institute for Government and Public Affairs here at the University of Illinois. Governor, thank you very much for being here.
Good to be here.
Okay. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs, our partners here today, the Edgar Fellows Program, the Student Bar Association, and our great staff here at the College of Law. All of them played a role in developing today's event. I want to give them a big thanks. I'd like to thank my friend Akshay Soman, the president of the Student Bar Association, who has graciously agreed to have a conversation with Governor Edgar alongside of me. So, Governor, let's get right to it. Akshay, why don't you take the first question?
Yeah, sure. So we know that for leadership, team management is very important. So we wanted to know from your perspective how important it is to pick your team and how do you choose your team members?
Well, I think when it comes to leadership, that's the second most important thing. Hopefully we'll get to the most important later, but as I always tell people, you're only as good as the people around you. And particularly, I think, in a position like an executive position, like I come out of state government, so I think you got legislative, judicial, executive, particularly an executive branch of government. To be an effective leader, you have to have a good team of people. So one of the most important things you'll do is who you pick to be on your team. And I want to use the word team because it's very important that the folks who are working for you feel like they're working for you and with you, and they're part of a team that at the end of the day, they have input. They help you reach a final decision on what you're going to do. So teamwork is extremely important. Picking the people, I always said, like when I would pick a cabinet, I wanted people that knew more about that subject than I knew. If I knew more than them, I don't need them, really. I mean, I need people who know more. And if you're going to be a leader, you're going to have to know a lot about a lot of things, but you're not going to know as much as you really need to know. So you need people who really are experts in that area. The other thing that I found that before you make a decision, make sure you take the time to listen to your team and give their opinion and to make sure they feel like they've had input. When I first became Secretary of State, which I did for 10 years before I was governor, that was back when you had patronage, where you could hire people because they were a Republican or a Democrat. And in the Secretary of State's office, there was about 3,500 employees. And they were the best Democrats in the state of Illinois. Because my predecessor had been Alan Dixon, who was a Democrat. He brought in all these Democrats. Then he decided to run for the U.S. Senate. But before he did, he coded them all in. So the next Secretary of State couldn't let them go because they were Democrats. You had to leave them unless you had cause, which is a very difficult thing to ever get anybody dismissed. So I inherited 3,500, as I said, the best Democrats, because that was the only job at that time the Democrats had statewide in Illinois. So all the county chairmen and all these key Democratic political operatives, they had a job in the Secretary of State's office. And I had all the Republican county chairmen wanted me to get rid of them because I was appointed to fill the vacancy. I said, well, the law is I can't do that. So I had to figure out a way as the incoming Secretary of State, who is a Republican, to convince all those 3,500 employees who were all good Democrats to be, they're part of my team, not to sabotage me. Because again, if the people that you're leading aren't gonna follow you, you're in big trouble. So we made a special effort to try to convince those folks that, you know, they were gonna be fired if they did their job, that they were fine. And I knew that we made progress because 2 years later I had to run for the office. And I had some friends in the legislature who were Democrats, and they came to see me and they said, we're really unhappy with the way you're treating our employees, because they were their people they had put in there. I said, what do you mean? I've been good to them. You know, they do their jobs, they get raises, they get promoted. They said, that's the problem. You've been too good to them. They won't do anything for us now, because they said, oh no, Edgar's been good to us. We're with Edgar. And so I knew we had succeeded. But that was very important, that they felt like, regardless of their politics, they're part of the team. And 12 years later, I was having my last fundraiser before I decided I wasn't going to run for governor again. And I remember we were out at the state fairgrounds. And I think tickets were $100 a person, which I thought was astronomical. And I'm standing there shaking hands with everybody coming in. And in come these two gentlemen who I had inherited when I became Secretary of State, and 16 years before. And here they were at my fundraiser when I was governor. And I said, what are you guys doing here? I said, you're retired and you're Democrats to boot. And they said, but we're Edgar Democrats. We're part of your team. And here, 16 years later, they still felt like they were part of the team. So that's extremely important, that you make your team feel like they are a team and they're part of your team to be able to get things done.
So how do you do that when there's such a power disparity? I mean, you're the governor, you've got a cabinet around you. I'd be kind of worried about, sort of challenging a sitting governor or, any other, major public official. How do you try to suss that out and invite people to disagree with you?
Well, I think the people that had worked for me, particularly my key staff in the governor's office or the directors, many of them had worked for me when I was Secretary of State before I became governor. I mean, I'm a great believer. I want to bring my team. I want to know the people I'm hiring. I'm not great at looking at a resume. I've seen enough resumes that I want to know somebody that knows somebody.
Okay.
I mean, when I'd hire people, I would say, I'd find somebody who knew him. I said, well, just if I didn't know him, because I trust people's judgment on other people. And also after a while, after they worked for me a while, I became very comfortable with them and knew I could count on them and they could count on me. So I moved a lot of people up. When I became governor, I had to assemble a cabinet. Now, many of those cabinet officials had to have an expertise that nobody coming out of the Secretary of State's office really had.
Right.
I was a great believer too in moving people up the ranks. Most of the people that I named directors of state agencies were people who were rank and file employees in those agencies. That never happened before. Department of Transportation, one of the most important positions a governor has to deal with. For a Secretary of Transportation, I appointed a career person in the agency. That never happened before. Usually you bring somebody in politically, but I wanted people that knew what they were doing. So, I thought a lot about who I hired. I interviewed everybody for directors, and I made the final call. But I also trusted people that I knew judgment who had worked with those people, and that paid off. So again, you've got to have a good team if you're going to be successful, particularly in an executive position. Legislator maybe is not quite as important, though if you're the speaker or if you're the Senate president, you've got to have a good team around you. But the people I had, they knew too that I wanted their opinions. And those who had worked with me knew that they could come in and disagree with me. I used to tell the story, my routine as governor is pretty much the same every day. I'd get up in the morning. I'm not an early riser. I hate breakfast meetings. No breakfast meetings existed for 8 years while I was governor, because I used to have to do that when I worked in the legislature. But I would get up, I'd get on the treadmill, I'd work out, and I'd be thinking about some problem we had to deal with. And I was amazing how, on that treadmill, I'd come up with a scheme how I'm gonna deal with that problem. That's pretty good. And then I'd hit the showers and I, be thinking it through, and we're gonna be able to pull this off. Then I'd walk over to the office and I'd assemble my staff. And then I'd start to tell them my scheme. And they were schemes sometimes. And I had particularly my press secretary, who was a few years older than I was, he used to smoke a pipe, but you couldn't smoke, so he'd just chew on the pipe. And he'd sit there and listen to me. And I noticed when I said my scheme out loud, it didn't sound as good as when I was thinking it in my head. And so I put out my plan, and he looked at me and he'd chew on his pipe, and he said, "Well, Governor, that sounds real good. How do you think that's going to read in the front page of the Chicago Tribune?" And I thought, well, it's not going to read very good. Well, he had a very nice way, most of the staff saying in so many words, "Governor, you're nuts. You can't do this." Now, that's extremely important, that you have people that feel comfortable telling you when you're nuts, when you're wrong. And you're going to be wrong. And the higher up you go in the political ladder or in the corporate ladder, the more you think you're pretty smart. You really have the answer. So it's extremely important that you encourage people around you to differ and to tell you you're wrong in a nice way. I mean, they didn't come out and say, "Governor, you're nuts." They do it in a nice way, but I knew what they were saying. And, we've had governors that have gotten in trouble. And I don't think they intentionally were dishonest, but they got to that point where they really believed whatever they thought they could do it. They could, you could get by with it. That's okay. And I think they discouraged the people around them from saying, "Hey, Governor, you can't do that. That's wrong." Because none of us like to hear criticism of something that we thought up. But you have to be willing to take criticism, and you have to listen to it. Now, there'd be times that I think they thought I was nuts, and I listened to them, and I said, "I'm still going to do this." When I first became Secretary of State, the big issue I decided to take on, this is how times have changed. In 1981, drunk driving was a joke. It wasn't a serious problem. People drank and drove. Nobody thought anything about it. We had laws, but they were weak. Illinois probably had the weakest in the nation. So I said as Secretary of State, since I'm the motor vehicle administrator, we're gonna crack down on drunk driving. And I remember all my staff and people I knew said, "You can't do that. You're gonna make people really mad at you." And I said, "Well, I don't care. We have terrible drunk driving laws, and people are getting killed." And now it helped. I don't drink, so I didn't have to worry about being caught and being a hypocrite. Now my predecessor had been arrested for drunk driving in California. He was out there visiting. He was in somebody's car, got arrested for drunk driving. He then, 6 months later, got elected to the U.S. Senate. That's how attitudes have changed.
Wow.
Today, no, drunk driving's a serious offense. People take it very serious. It's not a joke. Well, that wasn't true back then, but that's an example where, I said, "Okay, I listened to you, staff. I disagree. I think we need to do this." So you have to, times they're gonna criticize you and say, "You shouldn't do this," but you're still gonna think that's the right thing to do. But I have to say, most of the time, they were right. And thank heaven they caught me before I went out and did something that could have ended up getting me in real trouble. Not just political trouble, but legal trouble. So again, it goes back to, you have to create a climate, if you're the leader, where people feel comfortable telling you that you're wrong when they think you're wrong. And you have to also not blow up at them. You have to listen to them. And then if you decide, "Well, no, I'm still going to do and you tell them why, given the reason. And most time the staff will say, "Okay, I told him what I thought, but this is what he says we're going to do, and this is what we're going to have to do." So it's a two-way street too. The staff has to understand they are staff. They're not the lead person, and they need to have the chance to express themselves. But once they do that, then the head guy makes a decision that's different than that, they have two options: either they follow what the leader tells them, or they leave. Now, fortunately, I don't think I had anybody leave any time that I said I was going to do what I originally thought. But I will also say that I'd say that only happened about 10% of the time. Probably 90% of the time, I realized they were right and I was probably wrong, and it was that getting on the treadmill too early in the morning that caused all those problems.
Let's talk about, you said the most important thing in leadership is something, I think.
Other than staff.
Yeah, right. Tell us what's number one. What's
Okay.
the biggest?
To me, number one is trust. If the people you're leading don't trust you, you're not going to be an effective leader. This goes back to my definition of leadership. Everybody has their own definition. It doesn't mean there's just one right one, but my definition is to be an effective leader means you convince people to go where they don't want to go. Now, it's really easy if you're the leader, like in government, say to people, I'm going to cut your taxes. Well, that's a no-brainer. People love that. And they also like you to say, I'm going to spend more money on your program. Well, they like that too. Now think about that. Cutting taxes and spending more money, that's not a real good recipe for success long-term. And unfortunately, too often in government we do that because that's the popular thing to do. To me, the real sign of leadership is when you get people to accept something they don't want, like we're going to raise your taxes. And how you do that is, I think, they have to trust you. And trust, I found out early in my governorship, when I got elected governor back in 1990 in the election, I barely won. It wasn't until the next day we knew that I had won. I had many people say, oh, I went to bed last night, we're really worried about you. I said, how'd you go to bed last night if you didn't know yet how the election was going to turn out? You know, I'm sitting up there in that hotel room in Chicago just sweating out all those things. But one of the things I had said during that campaign was, and this is why probably it was a close election, we had a temporary increase in the income tax. First time the income tax had ever been raised in Illinois since it was created by a guy who I worked for many years ago. And, but it was going to expire the first year of the new governor's term. So the big issue was, as governor, are you going to make it permanent or are you going to let it expire? Well, the money went to local government and to education. State government really couldn't spend it on state programs. It went to education. University of Illinois got part of that money. Well, my opponent, who was a Democrat, would surprise people. He was against it. He wanted to just let it go away. And he said we can make up the difference out eliminating waste in government. Always be suspicious of anyone who says they're going to solve the financial problems by cutting waste out of government. Now, there's a lot of waste in government. There's some waste in government. I won't say there's a lot, there's some. But what I think is waste, you think is a good program, and what you think is a good program, I think is waste. So you never can get agreement on that. But that's never going to solve financial problems. I took the position as a Republican, and this bill had been passed by the Democrats. I don't think any Republicans voted for it. Now, Jim Thompson, who's a Republican, was governor, he signed it, which was the right thing to do. But I early in the campaign said, well, I think we have to make it permanent. I don't know where we're going to make up that money. State, I knew, was in financial problems. I didn't know how much till after the election, but I knew we couldn't make it without it. So I took the position, I'm for making it permanent, which just made all the Republican leaders in the state just furious with me, because people, they don't know what they want their taxes lower. They didn't want this increase permanent. Well, my opponent was against it. I was for it. Went through the campaign. It was very close. But after the election, even though every legislator, even those who voted for making that temporary tax, opposed making it permanent during the election, after I won the election, I got it passed. People understood that. People said, yeah, I don't like it, but he said he was going to do this. He leveled with us. So we trust him. And there are a lot of other things. We had to cut a lot of programs because we found out we had, at that point, the biggest deficit the state has ever had. And we had to cut a lot of programs, education programs, welfare programs, a lot of things that are really hard to cut. We had to cut those. And I had to convince people, I had to convince the legislature, convince the public to go along with that. But the reason I think I was able to do that was I had leveled with them. They trusted me. They didn't always like what I had to say, but they knew I wasn't going to lie to them. And 4 years later, I ran for re-election, and I won by the largest margin in the history of the state. And I think that was because people entrusted me. Not necessarily the policies I did, but just the fact but if you don't have that trust, then I saw one of my successors during one of his campaigns, he said, I'm gonna cut your taxes. Well, I thought at the time, we all knew you had to raise motor fuel tax and license plate fees because we needed a new road program. That was just, we knew that was gonna happen. I'm like, why didn't you say that? You know, he had a big lead in the poll at that time. He didn't need to say that. Well, he said it. And then the next year, he raised license fees. And people were enraged. And then he got accused of some illegal things that I don't think he himself did, but people didn't trust him. They didn't believe him any longer. And you could just see his approval ratings and his ability to get things done in the legislature just plummeted because people didn't trust him. And he was a one-term governor. So trust to me is the key. And you've got to tell people what they need to hear, not always what they want to hear. And that's tough in politics. It's tough in anything. People, you all, leaders particularly, we have pretty big egos. And we want to be loved. And you don't want to tell people things that are going to make them mad at you. I mean, that's kind of a given. But at the same time, if you're going to be an effective leader, you have to tell people what they need to hear. You have to lead them down that street they don't want to go. And to me, that's crucial. And if you don't have trust, I just don't think you're going to be an effective leader. Now, you might get some things done because they're popular, but you're not going to get the really important things done and the tough things done that a true leader has to do.
Yeah, so you kind of touched with trust, and trust I think is an important part of creating a vision as a leader. Can you talk more about how you create?
I hate that word vision. I think that's the most overrated word in
What would you call
America. You got to solve problems. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of looking down the road. When I first became governor, you say, "What's your vision? What's your vision?" Well, we talked about all these things in the campaign. They all disappeared after the election. Now I'm going to show my age here. Some of you in the audience, maybe 2 or 3 of you, might know what I'm talking about. In the 1960 election for president between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, which was the presidential election for me, I was 13 years of age and I was a political junkie. And I was for Nixon because I was a Republican. And Kennedy just beat the tar out of Nixon about the missile gap that he said Eisenhower had let develop. That the Russians were far ahead of us now in the missiles. And he just went on and on about that. About 4 months after the election, after Kennedy was safely in office on a Friday afternoon, I think they acknowledged there's no missile gap. So here they'd argued about something that really didn't exist. Same thing happened when I ran for governor. We talked about a lot of things, but the 2 biggest issues I had to deal with in my first 4 years as governor is, 1, the state was broke. We didn't really talk about that. And 2, I had to deal with the greatest natural disaster the state ever faced, the great floods of '93 on the Mississippi and Illinois River. Tens of thousands of people were displaced from their homes, and the state's responsible for that, not the federal government, the state's responsible. Well, we never talked about how you're going to deal with an emergency. Nobody had a clue, but those are the things I had to deal with. So sometimes I think a lot of what the rhetoric we hear in a campaign, and a lot of it's driven by the media, they'll find a couple of issues they like, and they'll just keep going on and on about it. But I think it's important that whoever is a leader says, okay, I've got these problems. Boy, I'd sure like to do this new program, but we don't have the money. I've got to live with the reality. I've got to keep the ship afloat. So, again, I think character is far more important than vision on an effective leader, because character didn't change. As I said, these issues, they change a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But whether you have a history of being someone who tells the truth, or someone who solves problems, or someone who will listen to other people, those characteristics don't change after the election, but issues do. So, as I said, I think anybody in leadership has to have a long-range plan and all that, but I think sometimes the media gets preoccupied with what a vision is, and it's based on some issue that really is not an issue. When it comes down to it, that's not what you have to deal with once you're in office. And as I said, my first 4 years, I didn't have the opportunity to think about any long-term. I had to just keep the ship afloat because we were sinking. Now, the next 4 years, when we got the state in better shape, there were things I could start doing, like trying to reform how we fund schools, reorganize part of state government, and do things that I just didn't have the luxury the first 4 years, because we just had to keep the ship afloat. We had to just make sure the basic problems facing state government were dealt with. And I think too often, those don't get the proper attention. Too often, a governor or some leader will come in and he's got this project, well, that's fine, but there's a lot of other just basic things that get forgotten. And then that unit of government or that state or whatever suffers. That's why even a president, the president's got to have some basic understanding, what is the role of the federal government? Yeah, there's other things we can go out and do. We can build walls, or we can do this and that, but you better make sure that Social Security checks are getting out on time, the post office works, all these basic things that I think, you have to, if you're gonna be an effective leader, you have to make sure it gets done. I've also say too, good government is kind of dull. And so the media doesn't really like it. I don't know how many times I have a press conference on some basic issue. It's pretty dull. And particularly the Chicago news media really didn't want to hear it about it. If you're going to get the coverage from Chicago media, you had to have something with pizzazz or some accusation against the mayor or something like that. You got up. I used to just go nuts when we'd have big issues and go up there. And when I was running for governor the first time, I wanted to establish that I knew government. Because I'd come up through state government. I wanted to show I knew how to deal with the state problems. And so we planned a series of press conferences on basic issues. The first one was on drugs. And I gave that at the Chicago Rotary Club, and it was at noon. And I don't usually give prepared speeches, but I had a prepared speech, and we had press releases, we handed them out. Only one reporter showed up to cover it, and that happened to be the political reporter for the Tribune, and he didn't come to hear about my policy on drugs. He just wanted to see how the campaign was going. Now, he wrote a good story on it. It appeared on the obituary page of the Tribune. Okay, next one we were going to do was on the environment. And we thought, okay, I did that at the Rotary Club. Back then, the Rotary Club was all a bunch of white men in suits, and that's not a good photo op, because particularly when you're running, you want television coverage. That's where most people get their news. And so we thought, okay, we're going to do something on the environment. We're going to do it on the Chicago River. And now, we did the Southern News Conference during the week, and there's a lot of things going on during the week, and Chicago media, state government's not their top priority. What's going on in City Hall is their top priority. There's an old saying, you can have nuclear war or a dogfight downtown in the Loop, and the dogfight would get the coverage in the media, because they're very parochial. What's going on in Chicago. So we planned this news conference. We said, let's do it on a Saturday morning. Nothing's going on Saturday morning, and we don't want to do it too early, because not only I don't like to get up early, they don't either. So we'll do it at 11 o'clock. It was a beautiful spring day. Just a beautiful day, right there on the river. We had charts, colored charts, we had everything. I get up there, nobody shows up.
Wow.
Well, I got to thinking, this is kind of dull, but it's important. Now, late in that campaign, it's the last weekend, and I'm doing my final run around, and we knew it was nip and tuck. It was going to go either way. And so this is really important, this last trip through the suburbs where all the votes are in the city. And my staff said, okay, now we accused my opponent of changing his mind a lot. He waffled. And so they said, we want you to hold up this frozen waffle and say, if my opponent's elected, this will be the state seal, a waffle. I kind of looked at it, well, that's as silly as I heard, but it was the last week in the campaign. I was tired, okay, I'll listen to him. And so I go around the suburbs that Sunday, press conference, holding up this waffle. Now, by the end of the last press conference, it was getting pretty soggy. But next day, what appears in the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times and the Tribune in color, me holding up that waffle. My opponent didn't make the front page. The lead on the evening news, television news, me holding that waffle. Now, Brenda, my wife, caught up with me later that day, and she said, boy, it's a good thing I wasn't with you, because I would have told you, don't you hold up that. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But that was pizzazz. That was different. And that, unfortunately, campaigns and what we talk about in campaigns and these visions sometimes are a lot of pizzazz. There's not a lot to them. And that's unfortunate. And that's why, again, I go back telling people, you better know something about the guy you're voting for, the woman you're voting for. What's their track record? What's their, what kind of character are they? Because to me, that's extremely important.
Governor, can you comment on the importance of collaboration? One of the things that I noticed when you were governor, you were able to work well with Madigan, and other, Jim Thompson, certainly was able to do that too. It doesn't seem like politicians today are, shall we say, as good at that across the aisle type of thing. Can you comment on what, any best practices for working across the aisle, and maybe to the extent you're able to, share what might not be going so well now?
Well, I think today we're way too polarized. And any of us in elected office, we like to blame the media for everything. But part of that is the media. I mean, when I grew up, I was a news junkie. I'd watch CBS News. I believed anything Walter Cronkite said. I didn't know till later I met him. After he was out of broadcasting, I was no longer governor. I met him. The guy was liberal as could be. But he never came across that way to me.
Yeah.
Now, we thought the network news was a little slanted to the left, but they all lived out in New York, and you understood that. But they basically, and they all had kind of the same story, but they also pretty much down the middle. I really thought he was a big fan of Eisenhower. I don't think he was, but I didn't realize that watching on news. Today, too much. I mean, it started with Fox. I'll just give them the credit and I'll give them the blame. I mean, the ones I think that started the network television news really getting polarized. Then you had CNN, used to be kind of down the middle, but now they've moved to the left.
Mm-hmm.
You got CNBC, they're to the left. And unfortunately, people watch the station that they agree with. In the old days, we didn't have that choice. We had CBS, NBC, or ABC in Chicago. You also had WGN, but they all had pretty much the same pitch on their stories. And it was more down the middle. Today, you don't have to do that. You can still watch them, and they're still somewhat down the middle. But you go watch the Fox, you agree with Fox, or you agree with CNBC, you go watch them. You don't watch the one that's kind of down the middle anymore. So we're polarized. And as a result, I think it's much more difficult to get people to come together. Elected officials, I think, reflect their constituents. People think they don't pay attention. They do. They pay a lot of attention to what the voters think. The other dilemma today is that most elections are decided in the primaries. And our legislative districts, congressional districts they're very Republican and very Democrat. There aren't that many swing districts
Right.
anymore. And we've just seen that as they drew this new map. There might be one swing district in all that. And so they worry about the primary. And who votes in the primary, usually in both parties, a greater percentage of the extremes. People in the middle, a lot of them just don't vote in primaries. They don't want to declare they're Republican or Democrat. That's why I've never liked, I want to have where you can go vote in a primary and you don't have to publicly declare I'm a Republican or a Democrat.
Right.
I united the Republicans and the Democrats on that issue when I was governor. They united to oppose my proposal. I never got any place on that. But, so it's more polarized today. People are very conscious of primaries. We need more people voting in primaries to get the middle to have more of an impact.
Right.
Because usually we get to an election, we've got either we have a left extreme and a right extreme as our final candidates. We don't maybe have somebody down the middle. But in my day, and I thought you were talking about leadership in the 21st century, I was in the 20th century. And some days I really feel like I was in another century. Things have changed so much.
Right.
But in my time in Springfield, people, the Republican-Democrat thing didn't mean as much to the elected official. Yeah, it did on election day. And there would be certain issues, like Mike Madigan, I knew, we weren't going to agree on some labor issues or on some business issues.
Right.
He had one point of view. But on fiscal issues, he was as tightwad as I was on spending money. And there were a lot of issues where we could find common grounds. We also knew there were areas where we had to compromise. And that's extremely important in a democracy. Really, to make a democracy work, you have to have compromise. That's the essence of a democracy to me. Because we have people with different points of view. I grew up in Charleston, Illinois, 50 miles south of here. Very waspy community. I mean, we thought somebody that was a Catholic was exotic. I mean, it's just, we didn't have people of Eastern European or We didn't have any African Americans, we didn't have any Hispanics. So I grew up in that environment. Now, I've tried to be broad-minded, and I'm viewed as a moderate Republican, probably almost a liberal Republican today. But I still had the biases of growing up as a Baptist in Charleston, Illinois. And I knew that, and I had to try to watch it when we were setting policy, that, because I grew up downstate in a semi-rural area, though we did have Eastern Illinois University, which added a lot to my upbringing, that I had to recognize somebody from the south side of Chicago probably came at an issue a lot different than I did. And I had to respect their point of view. I had to be willing to listen to it. And we had to try to find common grounds. And my time as governor, most of the time I had the Democrats in control of the legislature, both houses.
Right.
And I had to compromise. I had to, meet them halfway. Now, one of the tough things as a leader is, what are you willing to compromise, and what are things that are principles you should not compromise on? And I'll just tell people, that principle list should be a pretty short list, because most of the issues you're going to deal with, at least in government, and I think in the private sector and in life in general, are issues that you can find common ground with somebody you disagree with. Example on principles, came in, the budget, I was preoccupied with the budget. I'd never thought much about the budget until I became governor and found out the state was bankrupt. But then you had to worry about the budget. And so I said, okay, we're not gonna spend money we don't have. We're not gonna play games with the revenue estimates like they used to. If I've got the money, we can spend it, but if we don't have the money, we're not gonna spend it. Now, I'd present a budget to the legislature every year, and I spent a lot of time working on that budget. But I knew that there were certain things I wanted to spend money on that maybe the legislature wanted to spend it someplace else. And I had to accommodate their point of view. Now, we couldn't spend more money than we had. That took me a while. That took me overtime to convince Speaker Madigan and the rest of the legislators. I was serious. We weren't going to spend money we didn't have. And we weren't going to play games on revenue estimates like they had done. But once we got past that, then we'd sit down and, all right, you think we need to spend more money here. I think we should spend more money here. We'll compromise on that. And that's true of a lot of the issues you'll deal with in government. You can find some common grounds. And you have to respect their point of view. Now, it's also been my experience in government. A piece of legislation, a new policy that was reached by compromise, often is far better than something I had suggested or they had suggested, because that legislation, that new policy, had the input of a lot of different points of view in the state. So it was much more acceptable to people, because everybody could say, yeah, there's something in there that I agree with. When one party has complete control, and one person has complete control, and they do whatever they want to do, that policy usually doesn't work as well. It's not as acceptable to people. So compromise, I think, is a necessity to get things done, but also I think it creates better policy in the long run. And again, I want to go back, my mentor in state government was a gentleman named W. Russell Arrington. He was a state senator from Evanston, Illinois, Republican, conservative, though he was the most progressive guy in Springfield. I mean, he reshaped the legislature. He's the sponsor of the gun owner identification card in Illinois. No other state had that back then. I mean, today, people, Republican, they'd go nuts thinking you'd do something like that. Well, he would do things. He tried to sneak open housing through a Republican-controlled legislature. He didn't succeed, but he would do things like that. Well, Governor Ogilvie was the governor, and Arrington was the Senate Republican leader. And Ogilvie wanted to raise state gas tax to pay for mass transportation. Now, this was 1970. The only mass transportation in Illinois in 1970 was the CTA, which everybody in the suburbs and downstate viewed as the most dysfunctional, patronage-rich, inefficient government agency there was. So you imagine trying to convince downstaters, legislators, to vote for a gas tax on their constituents that basically was going to help the CTA. Didn't go very far. And Arrington tried, but it didn't happen, and it failed. The next day I went in his office. He was really upset. And I said, are you upset because we didn't do the gas tax last night? We were in a caucus, and finally his members just wouldn't do it. I said, you realize if you'd have kept pushing your caucus on this issue, they'd have thrown you out as leader probably. And he was a short guy. He looked up at me and he says, "Jim, you don't understand. We're here to solve problems, not to play politics. And we did not solve the problem last night." Well, that was kind of my introduction into government. And that always stuck with me. We're here to solve problems. And often to solve problems, you have to compromise. You have to work with people that you don't always agree with. The other thing to remember, you may not agree with that guy today, but tomorrow you might agree on an issue. So you don't want to go out and call that guy a crook. You don't want to attack him personally. You just, in a reasonable way, disagree. I tried never to personally ever say anything about anybody. Now, privately, I muttered about a lot of them. But publicly, I never did, because I knew, hey, tomorrow I might have to work with them. And I think part of that what helped me when I was governor was I had come up through the ranks of legislative staff, a legislator, then I worked in the governor's staff, been Secretary of State. So I knew from experience that you had to compromise at times. Sometimes we get governors coming in, they come in straight at the top, which is a dangerous thing. I firmly believe no one should be elected governor of Illinois or president of the United States who has not lost an election. Because nothing is more humbling than losing an election. And I've watched those who have not even run for office, let alone lose an election. They don't understand the process until it's too late. So compromise is extremely important. Working with across the aisle, you have to in many cases. There are things you're going to have on principles you're going to have to stick with, but as I said, most of the issues are going to be things you can compromise on. You can find common ground.
Good advice. Hey, actually, I think now we've got some great student questions here. Why don't we use the rest of our time and why don't you call on folks? Folks, we got Governor here answer some questions for you. So, who's got a question for Governor Edgar?
Hopefully they'll give you extra credit if you ask a question.
Yeah, no, the extra credit got him. All right.
There you go. Hi, Governor. Thank you for being here.
Tell me who you are, where you're from.
Sure. I'm Nick. I'm from Lamont, Illinois, just outside of Joliet.
Yeah.
You've had a long career, and you've made a lot of decisions, taken a lot of actions. Is there anything you wish you could have done differently?
Anything that you would have done differently, just to repeat for those?
Yeah. I've thought about that a lot. For the most part, no. I mean, that sounds kind of, but you make a lot of mistakes. Some personnel decisions, some issue decisions. I think one of the things I often said that when I left state government, I left the largest balance in the state treasury ever. It was $1.5 billion. And I was really proud of that because no governor's ever, usually the governor leaves a deficit. I got a deficit. But I really felt good about that. And 6 months later, they'd spent that balance, that surplus, and they were in the deficit spending again. And I've often thought I should have taken that money and put it into the pension fund. Now, contrary to what modern history has said, we actually left the pensions in a lot better shape when I left office than when I came in. The ramp, as they like to call it, it didn't work. It's just when they stopped paying into it and they increased other benefits. But I've often thought I should have probably, I never dreamed after what we went through in the early 90s, the legislature, even if the governor led the charge, would want to go back into deficit spending, but boy, they did it quick. So I kind of wish I'd left that. The other thing, as far as being myself governor, I wish I had been a little more relaxed. I was pretty uptight. I mean, I'm pretty relaxed now. People say, gee, we didn't know you had a sense of humor. And I said, well, I was governor. I couldn't afford a sense of humor, But I do look back, I wish I'd have been a little more relaxed, maybe smelled the roses a little more. My first year was just a terrible year. I mean, the state was broke. We were going through all these problems, and I was determined we were not going to spend money we didn't take and have it. So after we went 18 days without a budget, which at that point was historical. I mean, and I was scared to death. I'm the governor. We got to get this budget thing resolved. Madigan and I were fighting over the temporary tax. He wanted to make it temporary. I wanted to make it permanent. I didn't want to go through this every 2 years. So we eventually compromised. We made half of it permanent and half of it temporary. But anyway, so we'd gone 18 days, and Phil Rock, who was the Senate Democratic leader, really a nice guy. And Madigan and I were just fighting this whole 18 days, and Rock just wanted to go home. His wife was sick. He just was tired of all this. He just wanted to, let's compromise and go home. And I said, we're not going to compromise. We're not going to spend money we don't have. We've got to make this permanent. That's what it came down to, making it permanent. and Madigan wouldn't make a difference. So finally, after 18 days, we reached a compromise. So we passed the budget. And we were waiting, it took about 2 days after you get the agreement, you print the bills and all that. So the staff comes and said, oh, we made a mistake. We overspent about $1 million. No, I take that back. About $25 million. Now, this is on a $25 billion budget, and this is all somewhat estimates. Now, I said, well, we can't do that. I said, we gotta go back in and redo this budget. We gotta, well, that was an idiotic thing for me to say, but that's what I was just, And I remember I called Phil Rock up, and I said, Senator, Rock, we gotta rechange this. We gotta redo this. We're $25 million over. We can't have that. And there was a pause on the other end. He says, Governor, chill out. Now, I didn't. Now, I vetoed $25 million out of the budget. They promptly, and he led the charge, overrode me on that. I lost that one. But I didn't chill out, and I should have. And I think you need to take it very serious. And I think some don't take it serious enough. But I think at the same time, you've got to realize that, you've got to live to the next day. And a year later, I'm having surgery on my heart. 2 years later, I'm having quadruple bypass. I think I should have chilled out a little sooner. But I, for the most part, I felt pretty good about what we did. There are things that I would have probably done different if I'd had the chance. Probably made some different mistakes the second time, but felt pretty good about it.
Good.
Other questions?
Good. Yeah, other questions? Who else has got a question for Governor Edgar? Yeah.
Lauren.
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lauren Eaton. I'm from LaSalle, Illinois.
What year are you?
I'm a 3L.
Okay,
I think me and Ashley might be the only ones.
okay.
It's okay. I want to reframe my question because I was going to use the word vision before. What problem are you trying to solve with your Edgar Fellows program?
Well, the Edgar Fellow Program came about when, I was watching state government. I think, gee, it didn't work like it did when I was there. We actually could compromise. We actually got along. I can remember when I first went to Springfield a long time ago, the fall of 1968. And I watched the legislature in '69, which was probably one of the most productive session ever. Income tax was created, Department of Transportation was created, Department of Corrections was created, Department of Law Enforcement. A lot of things happened that session. It all happened in about 15 minutes when the deals were cut, when the compromise were reached. And I thought, this is neat, this is the way it works. Well, what it was people knew each other. They'd been in the legislature for a long time. They socialized. Now, one of the things too, I don't drink, I don't go out at night, so I didn't socialize like a lot of them did. But a lot of that goes on in Springfield. It might be a shock to you to find that out. But it did, it used to anyway. And guys would go out at the bars at night, Republicans and Democrats. They'd socialize. They got to know each other. That's why I think the softball game is good. I never got to play because the Democrats controlled it and they wouldn't let us Republicans play. But, it's still, anytime you get people away from their job and socializing and mixing together or traveling together or doing things, I think helps. So my thought was, okay, let's identify some of the up-and-comers in state government and local government. Who are going to be I'll just say, I want to have the future governor and the future mayor of Chicago or the future speaker in this program. And I want them, when they become that, they know each other already. They socialize down at the I Hotel. One of the most successful part of our program, and I have to say I did not foresee this, is that bar at the I Hotel. This year we had them, and they close that usually at 9 o'clock. When Janet, who is runs the day-to-day things on the Edgar Fellow, she got them to keep it open till midnight as long as there was somebody there. Well, we didn't want them all going downtown to socialize. We wanted to, of course, you still had limits on what you could do, but they stayed there. Well, they spent a lot of time getting to know each other. Now, we had them talk about issues, we had speakers in, and that was all well and good, but the most important thing of the Edgar Fellows is to get those 40 individuals to get to know each other and to find out, hey, I'm from Chicago or I'm from downstate, but I really got a lot in common with this person from Chicago or this person from downstate. I'm a conservative Republican or I'm a liberal Democrat, but that guy's not a bad person. I remember we had, one person got up and said, you know, she was from the south side of Chicago, said, I'd never really been around a Republican before, but they're not so bad after all. Now, she was a little kidding, but there's some truth to that. So now we do have, the Speaker of the House was an Edgar fellow, and he was very good. I mean, I watched him. He worked that crowd. I mean, he was as social with the Republicans as he was the Democrat. I think that's why he's Speaker of the House today. It was a little different than the style of Mike Madigan. I think people wanted it. They wanted somebody that they all could feel comfortable. So that's the purpose of the Edgar Fellows. Is yeah, we want them to know, get information, everything, but mainly we want them to get to know each other. One of the things, again, this is something I didn't listen to my staff. When I created this program, I said, first of all, every program, and there's maybe 4 programs a day, I want them to move their seating assignment. I want them to sit by somebody different. I'm a great believer in seating assignments. I think it's really important that people move around. I think one of the big failure of the Illinois General Assembly is that all the Republicans sit on one side, all the Democrats sit on the same other side, and they sit next to the same person day after day. In committees now, when I was there, we used to just mingle. And I didn't go sit with the Democrats. I got to know them. I might need their vote. And, you know, and actually that paid off later when I was running for governor. I had a couple of those former Democratic legislators support me because I sat by them in committee. I got to know them. So one of the things I said, we're going to have this, and the fellows will come in, they all kind of moan and groan about this moving around. And every year at the end, we always get us, oh, what worked, what didn't work. They all say, what really worked was moving us around. We got to know everybody here. Because we'd always start out the session before the speaker would speak. I'd say, okay, turn to the person next to you and tell them what your favorite book is. Or tell them where you like to go on a vacation. Or tell them who's your political hero, or whatever, just to get them to talk to each other so they kind of know each other. So it's not a big thing, but I think it really has helped. And we've had a lot of people tell us as a result when they went back to Springfield, or when some of them weren't even thinking about going to Springfield, but then they said, hey, I want to go into state government, and they become legislators. But they say, well, we now know people on the other side of the aisle or in the other chamber that we wouldn't have known otherwise. And it makes it so much easier to get things done. So that's the purpose behind the Edgar Fellows. And I'm still hoping that someday that, you know, I have the governor and the mayor, and they both were Edgar Fellows, and they both got to know each other, and they will listen to me. So far, I haven't succeeded on them listening to me. I always have advice for these people, but they don't always listen to me. But they do acknowledge they enjoyed the program.
Well, certainly, I think it's a good place to leave it. Governor, you've given us some great advice. Let's give Governor a nice round of applause. We're at the end of that. Thanks for coming in, and thank you all for being here. I believe the lunches are outside. And thanks to all of you online for joining us, and we'll see you at our next Leadership Project event. Thanks for coming.
Well, I'm glad they're feeding you.